Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science, now available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, anywhere you get your fine books. I'm Joy Moore, here with my co-author Kent Anderson, and today is Wednesday, November 5th, 2025. Hey, Kent.
Hey, Joy. So it's exciting that our book's available for pre-order, isn't it?
It is.
We had to change our intro too. You got to get used to that.
Help us out. Pre-order our book.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I reread it and I worry every time I see it. I hope this lives up to expectations. Then I reread some of it and I'm like, actually, it's what I at least wanted
hmm
I'm happy with it. So I'm continue to be happy with it. So yeah, give it a shot. Give it a
Yeah,
shot. But we just had a really great interview with Nick Evans.
we did. Yeah, he's fascinating. As I mentioned when we talked, that I ran into him at the Peer Review Congress in Chicago a couple months ago, where he gave a really interesting talk. And so we connected, and I looked into a little bit more of the work that he does. And it just reminded me, I mean, one of the, I think, wonderful aspects of the type of work that you and I are doing is um, researching and writing, but really looking to other people and learning different ways of examining things, interesting things, and how they come together in really practical ways. And so it was really cool to get the opportunity to meet Nick and hear about his work and get his take on things.
Absolutely. I mean, like you and I were talking to someone else yesterday, and I mean, the whole reason I've always done this is to figure things out, and so to have our network expanding with this podcast and other things, and you go into that meeting, and meeting him, and that he's a new name, and but great interview and a lot of great insights, and somebody he also does gain of function research, has a book called Gain of Function, right? That we'll
Mm-hmm.
talk about a little bit, and yeah, so he's a fascinating guy and really interesting to hear how he's managing his career path as well, given his ambitions and the way that academia works and his understanding of incentives. And yeah, just a really reasonable, down to earth, grounded person who, really loves community, which is something else that resonates, I think, with both of us.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but we're not going to steal the whole interview. We'll let you hear from Nick right now. So, without any further ado, let's move to our interview with Nick Evans.
Today, we're talking with Nick Evans, who's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy in the College of Fine Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. So I didn't know who Nick was until I saw his talk at the recent peer review congress in Chicago. And then I have to confess, I ambushed him in the hall after I think I interrupted a conference call that you were on, Nick, because I wanted to see if we could connect so I could learn more about the research that he does and the intersection with public policy. And he was polite enough to indulge me, and we connected. And then I looked up his bio and some of his publications, and I learned like what a fascinating combination of interests and specialties he has. And what I wanted to do today is introduce you all to Nick, learn more about his work, and see what the rest of us can take away from it. So, welcome, Nick.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome.
So, tell us about your background. Where did you come from?
So I have a circuitous background. My first degree was in physics, and so I was a kid who wanted to be an astronaut, and uh, I guess that still remains the case. But I did a degree in physics, and then while I was doing that, I was working in a very small branch of nuclear physics, and I got to reading the history of the U.S. nuclear program, and I decided that I was actually much more interested in what scientists did and why they did it than I was in actually doing science itself. So I pivoted to where the money is and did a PhD in philosophy at the Australian National University. Um, and then I worked for the Australian government for a year as a policy officer in their universal health insurance branch. So I was part of the team who figures out how much the government will pay for a particular procedure to doctors as part of Australia's universal healthcare system. And then I did 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania in a postdoctoral fellowship supervised by Dr. Jonathan Moreno before I got my I guess my big kid job as an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy. And when you so-called ambushed me, Joy, I was actually in the first department meeting of my new department. I just transferred my tenure to the Department of Political Science because, as you saw from the talk that I gave in Chicago, I still do philosophy, but I also do a fair bit of empirical research these days. And for the purposes of promotion, philosophy departments don't really do, surveys or experiments. So I moved to a department that did those, so that I could kind of continue my career trajectory in a place that understood my brand, and was going to kind of promote me up through the ranks, of their department.
Hmm.
So tell me about the work that you presented at the Congress for those who weren't in attendance.
So, uh, back in the dark ages of COVID, which feel like they were a million years ago, some days, and then some days feel like they were yesterday, um, I and a colleague of mine who was at the National Institute of Allergen and Infectious Diseases, is now an assistant professor in the Department of Population Health at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. So she moved literally across a highway in Bethesda to get her new job. Emily Ricotta, she and I were talking about preprints, and we were expressing a bit of frustration about just the number of preprints and how difficult and how onerous it could be at times to try and figure out which preprints were good and which preprints were not so good. Um, COVID in some ways, I mean, scientific preprints have existed in some ways for hundreds of years, right? People just used to kind of send letters to each other, and now we have preprint servers, repositories. But COVID was really the first infectious disease outbreak of note that was that had this extreme kind of input from scientific preprints. So people would do research on COVID, and they would throw it up on medRxiv or bioRxiv or SSRN. And then people would litigate what the content of that paper was, what the results meant, what it meant for public policy, what it meant for medicine, either in their own preprints or on Twitter, which in retrospect was probably not a great idea for all of us. And Dr. Ricotta and I wondered what the effect of preprints was on public policy. Now, it's really difficult to understand what the effect of preprints are on public policies, because for anyone who's read public policy, unlike academic articles, they do not cite their work very often, right? So
Mm.
there's not a bibliography at the end of every piece of CDC guidance or every NIOSH policy statement. But what we could do is we could look at the documents that informed policymakers. So we reached out to a team at Griffin Scientific, which is a boutique consulting company, or was a boutique consulting company in Tacoma Park, just outside of DC. They're now a part of Deloitte. And they had been conducting a policy guidance exercise for NIOSH. And so they were providing weekly updates on occupational health and other areas of interest to NIOSH, and kind of where the state of the science was during COVID. And they also mentioned that the Department of Homeland Security published the master question list every day for most of the kind of acute phase of COVID, which is this enormous document of it's like the world's greatest FAQ on COVID.
Mm.
And one of the really cool things about these documents is that they are living documents, and so they have daily editions. And so they're extensively cited, and we were able to look at them and figure out where they were using preprints. And so we started with the MQLs over the year that we chose as our study period, which was from February 2020 to February 2021. There were 1,800 unique citations, of which approximately 450 were preprints that had later been published during the study period. Now, no one's got time to read 900 scientific papers and do line by line comparisons of them. So, one of my students, who did get his degree in philosophy, but also is a pretty good Python coder, he borrowed an algorithm that another researcher at the University of Georgia had made and modified it so that it would take the abstracts of the preprint and its publication of record version and do a line by line comparison, or sorry, a word by word comparison of the abstracts. So this is a tokenized algorithm. It's almost exactly the same way as things like ChatGPT works, right? So you find tokens, which are usually sentence fragments, and you compare them, and then you use maths to kind of judge the probability that a difference in um, two fragments in the same point in the document has occurred by chance. And so then this gives you a big list of sentence changes. And then I and another member of the study team, we sat through and we, between the two data sets, so the two policy corpuses, we read 10,000 sentence level changes across 600 papers or so to understand what was being changed between papers and then figure out which changes were significant, and then if they had an
Hmm.
influence on policy, and then if the documents had actually been updated once those were published. Um, so that was how we did this study. And so in Chicago, I kind of presented this method of understanding preprints because preprints are really useful for getting information out fast, but if you believe that peer review does anything, one of the reasons for peer review is that it will generate kind of a criticism of the paper that ultimately makes it better by allowing independent observers to pick out problems with a paper that the author team then has to resolve. So you're trading off that review function for the speed of getting something out. And the essential question that we had was, in some cases, is it better to wait? Because if you propagate an error into a large policy document, do you actually end up with spurious policy guidance? And as anyone who's been around COVID long enough knows, one of the big things that happened around trustworthiness and public trust during COVID was that when governments flip-flop on policy guidance in a pandemic, the
Hmm.
public loses faith very, very quickly.
Yep, absolutely.
And then one of the things is not only the errors, but I think I remember you talking about it's also the language, and that's something that is, from a draft abstract or maybe something that was just put together quickly for a preprint
Mhm.
versus what goes through editorial acceptance and peer review. The language can change, and a lot of that has to do with potentially language around certainty or predictive outcomes or things like that.
Exactly. So, when it comes to some of these papers, one of the things that's really interesting is that it's not just, as you said, that we're observing an effect, but all public health measures are based on risk assessment, right? So, it's very hard to know what's going to work and what's not going to work in a pandemic, or to know with a very, very fine level of detail. And that's often what some people want. Um,
Mhm.
and so when you publish a paper in a preprint that says we have found, based on an early sample of patients, that a certain kind of methylprednisone, for example, relieves certain symptoms of COVID for high-risk patients or very vulnerable patients in the ICU. Um, and then you discover later that the analysis wasn't done quite right. And so the level of confidence you have around that has changed with a drug that might be in short supply or is being used in other patients, right? Methylprednisone has a lot of uses outside of being used to like as a recovery drug during pandemics.
Hmm.
Then you might be diverting resources that are harming other people, in addition to
Mm.
costing people kind of their confidence in the system.
Hmm.
And so we found like a number of really interesting cases where uh, the lack of peer review, at least in theory, would have caught something that was actually really significant to the way that people understood guidance for pandemic responses.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember during the pandemic, there was, and this is, it's funny to see this coming back, but powerful telephoto lenses are really becoming useful again.
Mhm.
So, because there's a government that is really kind of bent on secrecy right now, and so you have people taking pictures of, signal chats over the shoulders from far away of people who are trying to conceal their little goings on. And I remember during the pandemic, there were photographs of people walking across the portico of the White House. I think it was some of the people who were trying to get ivermectin and other things recommended and influence the president's, messaging around hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and they were seen clutching. And if you zoomed in, it was definitely something from bioRxiv or medRxiv. It was a preprint, and that's that. So there's the policy document aspect as well as the social
Mhm.
component, because there's also a huge amplification into the public sphere of preprints that goes on at the same time. So, that it's great to look at the policy documents and kind of the official and well-controlled channels, but there's also this other side of it that is less formal and harder to capture.
Yeah, preprints were the Wild West at some points. And one of the things that's really important to understand about the way that these policy documents were created is that there were usually teams of PhD level scientists who were poring over the literature for the day that had just come out to try and figure out what to put in these guidance documents. So these guidance documents were not the full sum of all possible preprints. In fact, they were very, very select.
Hmm.
So our corpuses had preprints that made it to publication something like 80% of the time,
Yeah, that's
which
very
was
selective.
yeah, it was 4 times higher than the average preprint. And
Hmm.
the average COVID preprint was, I believe, 4 times higher than the average preprint across all preprints.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
this was a very like well done job ultimately, right? And so one of the interesting things as we're finishing our write-up, it has been a very busy year for everyone. So this has taken a little bit more time than we would have liked, is that we're not saying that preprints are a bad thing for policy guidance. What we are saying is that there are select cases and often select fields where jumping on an idea early can have long-term consequences.
Hmm.
And that, in fact, we can actually have a much more nuanced view of what preprints can do in public policy on a almost discipline to discipline level.
Mhm.
Because, as you said, when it comes to ivermectin, the master questions list by DHS reported the so-called positive effects of hydroxychloroquine, and then that was never rebutted in the MQLs. It just kind of disappeared at some point.
Hmm. Right.
Um,
Mhm.
the MQLs was the Department of Homeland Security saying, if you are setting policy, our guidance, our opinion is that hydroxychloroquine has a clinical benefit in cases of COVID-19. And that was
Right.
simply not true. And it was based on preprints, not on peer-reviewed results.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
And I think that and thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic when all the publishers and people working in medical journals and in research really came at it with the best of intentions is the best we don't know what to do, but the best we can do is open it up and give as much daylight to as many ideas as we're trying to figure it out. But then since then, it has took hold. And so now we're seeing the use of preprints for things that are basically to circumvent the peer review process to go straight to policy and to influence a lot of information and misinformation campaigns because of different agendas.
Well, I
Um,
think that I'd even flip it harder. I think that it's narratives have developed, and now they're writing preprints for those narratives,
yeah, that's right. We saw one the other
or
day.
even papers in what we call gaslight journals.
Yeah, we saw one the other day where they announced their findings the day before they posted their preprint.
Hmm.
So it was
Yeah.
already in the, probably hundreds of thousands of subscribers in their social media space before the paper was even published on Zenodo. And so what can you even do about that?
And this is in some ways, this is a continuation of like a fairly old practice at this point in kind of not old, I guess it's old for modern science, which is, most universities have, like a communications office, and they will communicate via often embargoed or like kind of like restricted access websites to journalists, right? We
Hmm.
have a study that
Hmm.
has done X, Y, and Z, and so you will have a study that is released um, in Nature or Science or a professional journal, and then at the same time, dozens of articles on that particular study. And those articles are of varying value. Anyone who's spent long enough on the internet and internet news knows that there's a very wide diversity of kind of quality and affiliations and funding and ideologies and news sources. So the discourse around the science can actually run well in advance of anyone actually reading the gosh darn paper
Hmm.
because you see the New York Times talking about it before you've had a chance to open it, much less read the methods, much less look at the supplement or whatever.
Hmm.
And it's the internet. Eyeballs are money, and
Hmm.
so there are incentives against reporting things saying, hey, this is a paper that's cool, but of limited, benefit because it's one small piece of a giant puzzle. But you're right that preprints have accelerated this. And the marketplace of ideas is one of the most enduring myths of, kind of the American zeitgeist. We believe that it's always better to talk about something than it is to not talk about something. The problem is that ideas and words are not market goods because they are non-excludable. Once you have said them, you cannot unsay them. You cannot
Hmm.
reclaim your words. So not only are the economists wrong about that, but kind of this belief that we have means that falsehood is easier to perpetrate, even accidentally,
Yeah.
than truth.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of with the change in the administration and the change in the way a lot of public policies are being set just in the last 9 months um, is that there's a new team in town who understands that public opinion can influence public policy much faster and using scientific research either by publishing their own papers or putting their opinions on other people's papers and getting it out into the public sphere makes it so much easier for them to show up at the White House and say, don't take Tylenol.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Because
I mean,
they've already got a whole team of, they've got a whole support from their followers who are ready to hear it and they're already excited to ratify it.
I think that and I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me about 2025 around this issue is that the examples that we have this year are like cartoonish almost, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
If I was trying to pitch something to Netflix that was based on
You
any
can't make it
true
up.
fact about 2025, it would be knocked back for being too out of hand, right?
Yeah,
Um,
implausible.
Right, even like Arrested Development didn't anticipate quite how bonkers, the discussion about the wall was going to be. And if you remember that show had an
Yeah.
entire subplot about building a wall on the southern border,
Right.
like as a bit. But you know, there has been a bipartisan tendency towards using this glut of information to maneuver people in certain ways. So, you know, uh, one of my favorite examples, because this is really close to home for me as someone who, in some ways, like a lot of academics, was kind of left to fend for himself around school reopenings and what to do with classrooms. And, I'm not going to say that my university wasn't supportive. They very much were. And I was able to serve on committees and give guidance as a bioethicist who also studies infectious disease, which is not a common job description. Um, but some of the earliest papers on the transmission in primary and secondary schools between children and family members were published as preprints first, and they reported no significant increase in the rate of contracting COVID from families with school-aged children. And after peer review, it was found that there was a significant increase,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And so if you remember fall of 2020, there was a huge push, not just by Republicans, but by liberal commentators at Brown or at Harvard or Hopkins, of people going, we need to send our children back to school, right?
And they're still saying it. I just read something about it a couple weeks ago.
Right. And we
Yeah,
didn't know anything about long COVID. We knew that symptoms in children were much, much less
milder.
serious or,
Hmm.
milder than they were in adults, which is great. But we didn't know about the association between the severity of COVID and long COVID. And we still are very muddy on that. And we didn't actually have good data on secondary transmission back into family members who may include vulnerable family members, parents, grandparents, right? And also we didn't understand transmission between children and teachers, right? And we were not treating teachers as uh, as frontline healthcare workers and providing them with the
Mm.
tools to act as such. I remember there was one particular New England Journal of Medicine article or an op-ed about sending kids back to school that actually said, like, it basically said, presumably teachers will be able to get access to masks and relative and relevant personal protective equipment. And it's like, I'm sorry. Uh, I mean, maybe the school districts around Jamaica Plain, right, and like Harvard Square,
Right,
but like
right, right,
not like actual Americans. And
right.
so
Mm.
preprints preprints give a first responder advantage in information kind of situations, and sometimes that's extremely useful, and
Mm.
sometimes it's really really harmful. Um,
So I
and
want to jump in
it's the
there
wrestling of
because
it.
it's
Yeah.
kind of it's like you said, preprints and the private sharing of early drafts and things like that is time-honored
Mm.
scientific
Yeah.
communication practices, and it was even up until I think there were surveys in the 90s where scientists were asked about sharing preprints electronically, and they were very
Yeah.
much in favor of it,
Mhm.
but then they became platformed.
Right.
And that seems to be, and you do a lot of research on dual use technologies and dual use findings in science. And it seems like that platforming brought preprints into a dual use mode, right? Before when they were private, it was single use. It was,
Yeah.
I'm sending you this for your commentary so I can improve it before I submit it to a journal.
Mhm.
That was the full use of it. Now it's, dual or multiple uses. Is that a fair way to think about it or frame it?
Yeah, so when I talk about dual use in my work, I'm usually very careful to say that typically like the bad use that I'm thinking is like a weapon of mass destruction. But to
A
use
little more
a
severe.
well, but like the end of American democracy is, arguably in
Yeah,
some ways
mass
worse than weapons of mass
destruction.
destruction, right?
Well, or the whooping cough outbreak in Louisiana, or the measles outbreaks in Utah and Colorado now, and
Yeah.
all driven by, misinformation perpetrated by dual use
Yeah, I believe it
papers,
was
right?
Kathy O'Neill who referred to bias in science as weapons of mass distraction, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think that this is really the case because I don't put things on preprints mostly. One is because places like medRxiv don't really accept bioethics papers as the relevant kind of research, right? I mean, ask a scientist to believe that what I do counts as research. But so I don't really publish like that, but also I have a real, um, I like community, right? And to me,
Hmm.
throwing something up on a website is not community, right? Community
Hmm.
is like the interactions that you have with people around you, with people that you know well. But I send my papers to colleagues all the time, right? For their
Yeah,
responses, for their thoughts.
absolutely.
Often I'll do like, I'll send it to an expert in the area, and I'll send it to a non-expert in the area because sometimes the non-experts have insights that I don't, because I'm too close to an issue. But once you put it up on a platform, you are basically making it available to anyone who wants it. And you are removing the intent of the distribution from the equation and basically saying whatever the audience wants out of getting early access to this paper is fair
Hmm.
game. And as it turns out, there's a lot of people who want access to that information for something other than to give you feedback on your work.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big drivers where publishers and editors have embraced preprints, even though their primary business concern is to do peer review and publish final products out of these papers, is to comply with funder
Mhm.
requirements. And so there's been an outside force where funders want to make sure that the results of the research that they have paid for is going to be available to anybody who wants it for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And so that's created this environment where some people are there are many different motivations for publishing preprints, as you said.
Right.
And some are doing it just simply to comply with the terms of their grant. And then you have multiple copies in different places. And then, like you said, you could have a final version that's published somewhere else that has slightly different language, or
Mhm.
maybe has been improved or corrected in other ways. But each version of that is now getting a DOI. It's indexed on multiple platforms. It's therefore in Google Scholar. It might be on ResearchGate, maybe in PubMed. And so that's one of the things that Kent and I talk about a lot is what we call the automated box of confusion.
Mhm.
As soon as something is published anywhere and gets a DOI, it gets propagated and indexed, and the spaghetti of it is impossible to
Well,
disentangle.
there's a paper on medRxiv. I believe it's still there. I check in on it every 6 months or so just to see if it's okay. And it's the paper that claimed that researchers had found a sequence from HIV-1 in the SARS-CoV-2 virus genome,
Oh, that
right?
one. Yeah.
And it was a SNP, right? But I mean, as someone I think said on Twitter, it's like saying that you found a work of Shakespeare because you found a random thou in a document, right? It's
Right. Right. Yeah.
like it's not like factual in any sense. It's not methodologically rigorous. It has no grounding in like how biology works. Of course, viruses have common short sequences of DNA in very large, DNA complexes in common, right? That doesn't mean
Right.
anything.
Right.
Um, but to what you said, I think that there's lots of incentives to want preprints, right? You
Mm.
mentioned some, I think that there are, I have this joke that there's like a flavor of kind of elder statesmen of science who their argument for preprints really seems to be that they don't like receiving criticisms from people.
Oh yeah,
And so like they just want to like put their ideas out in the world and like, there's
because I
nothing.
said so.
Well, and
Yeah.
they're tenured, they have their own labs, they have postdocs to write their papers for them. They don't really need what papers provide the rest of us in academia anymore. So they just want to like blog about it, but blog about it in like like with the veneer of academia.
Right.
Hmm.
There are people who you know as an associate editor at a journal, peer review is getting harder and harder to do because people are busier and busier. They are less likely to say yes. Their peer reviews are less kind of rigorous. They're less compassionate. They're less helpful. They're less constructive. So people have really like valid criticisms of the peer review process, which are in some ways structural on academia. And then
Hmm.
finally, there are assistant professors who are expected to have a H index of a certain amount, right?
Yeah.
And Google Scholar indexes your preprints. So if you can get cited when something is still a preprint, and that will meet your annual workload report or your tenure requirements or whatever it is that you need it for, there are incentives to get it out in the world that have nothing to do with progressing science and everything to do with meeting the metrics of the institution that is going to keep you in mortgage payments.
Yeah.
Or if you're Gen Z and you no longer have the ability to afford property in America, your rent payments.
Right,
So,
right.
I think we have to understand that preprints serve a function, and
Hmm.
those
Hmm.
functions are varied depending on who you are in academia, where you are in medical research, and that in fact, like propagating new scientific ideas is a very small component of that particular process. Kind
Hmm.
of when you get down to actually how this is worked out in a material way.
Yep,
Hmm.
yep,
Yeah, and then there's a lot of, unintended consequences, which is what I found really fascinating about your work is, people might be, like you said, publishing preprints for all different reasons, but they don't know that it might be picked up and ratified in a public policy, and it's not even if it's not even directly cited, you might not even know, you know.
Yeah, and we found I'm still waiting on my team. We have a little bit of revisions to our analysis to do before we kind of get this out into publication, not into a preprint. We did talk about like the irony of publishing our preprints paper as a preprint. But you know, there is at least eyeballing it, there is a considerable difference between these two corpuses from two different government agencies who hired two different groups to do two different kind of jobs in the rate at which they select preprints that have significant issues for policy. So what you're doing now is you have these groups who have to now screen their preprints and the rest of the scientific literature, but they have to do the job basically of peer reviewers of deciding whether the preprint is worth it to make it into the official policy guidance record.
Hmm.
And that's a like a division of labor that from a public policy kind of framing we have not yet really or I have not seen really discussed, right, about the like how scientific labor is mobilized to sift through the sea of ideas in the literature now and actually put it into a coherent policy document, which is another issue our that our research raises.
Mm.
yep. I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, thank you.
So now you
Um,
have a book out as well?
I do.
mhm.
It's called
Yes.
Gain
Yeah.
of Function.
Yes, and it's part of the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series, I
Correct.
believe. And there were a couple quotes that kind of jumped out at me. And one of them was expecting scientific grounding in science policy can be understood as a neat way to crash a policy process altogether. That is, uncertainty is painted as a reason to forego meaningful regulation or reform. So can you talk about this certainty, uncertainty risk as it
Yeah.
relates
Yeah.
to public policy?
So I will utter a phrase that if there's any listeners, American listeners, will make them feel a little bit queasy, which is the precautionary principle. And this comes out of the environmental movement, and especially in the 1990s, we have the Rome Statute, and really what is happening in the climate change movement, which was still moving at the time, as opposed to what it is now. Um, there was this pushback from certain scientists around and policymakers and lobbyists around the idea that we didn't know that the climate was changing in a way that was deleterious to human health, and we didn't know to what extent. And so accepting regulations on emissions or total carbon loads for countries or certain kinds of industrial practice was premature because we had yet to kind of really sort out the facts of the cost benefit analysis scientifically about whether the regulatory solution was going to benefit us more than it harmed us, and whether it was
Hmm.
actually going to solve the problem and whether or not the problem existed. And so there's this phrase that is later called the precautionary principle, which is this idea that an absence of scientific evidence is not itself a reason to forego regulation in cases of kind of extensive risk. When we're thinking about public policy. Now, I'm not necessarily a proponent of the precautionary principle itself, but one of the important lessons from this that has come across areas of laboratory biosecurity, around artificial intelligence, around lots of emerging technologies, is this idea that people will use uncertainty around a particular set of outcomes as a reason to forego making a decision,
Hmm.
right? When it comes to artificial intelligence, right? People are like, artificial intelligence could take everyone's jobs. And people go, but you don't know that, right?
Hmm.
Maybe
Hmm.
it'll make a whole bunch of new jobs, and those new
Hmm.
jobs will be great. So we shouldn't do anything about the economy when it comes to artificial intelligence above and beyond letting, the market figure it out or whatever, because we don't know if trying to sort it out could be worse than artificial intelligence taking all of our jobs. And, when you phrase it like that, it's like, how could the industrial solution to artificial intelligence be worse than artificial intelligence crashing the employment market? But, um, this is a really common problem where people say, but you don't know, so we
Hmm.
ought to forego doing anything about it, just in case the cure is worse than the disease, effectively.
Right.
Yeah.
And we see this everywhere in policy that is guided or informed by science.
Yep.
Hmm. And we're seeing it even more. I think that's the most popular perspective in terms of what's going on
Yeah, it's a
in
rhetorical
the
device that's
HSOs.
being used a lot to
Yeah,
advance things that have even, I mean, there's more uncertainty on their side in some
Mhm.
ways than
Yeah,
otherwise. And so, but they, if you deploy that, if you're the first to deploy that rhetoric, you have an advantage in the conversation.
yeah, and there's this kind of, and then there's like extra moves that go on in this kind of rhetorical chess game because,
Hmm.
a lot of this is grounded in this, especially here in the United States, is grounded in this idea that the benefits of science and technology are inevitable and the harms are only possible, right? And if you frame it like
Mhm.
that, then sure, why wouldn't you want more science and technology, right?
Right. Or
Maybe
we'll
people
solve
are
them
going to
with
get,
more science and more technology.
yeah, which will be really good for the people who make money off
Good.
of science and technology, right?
Right.
Hmm.
And then people will say, well, and also, because one of my big interests is the way that political infrastructure mediates the benefits of science and technology, right? My good friend and colleague at Yale, Jason Schwartz, he is a vaccine policy researcher. So he's not a vaccine researcher. He studies the history of vaccine policy. He likes to say that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations save lives. It does
Yep.
not matter if you've got it on a shelf, it's got to be in someone's arm, which we are starting to find out more and more at the moment.
Yep. Yep.
And so then there is this debate that happens in science policy circles where people go, but it's better that it's on the shelf than it doesn't exist at all, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so
But there's
this
this
is all
concept
about
called herd
optimism,
immunity, so
right? This is really a lot about optimism in the power of science and technology to solve our problems, and this is, I think, really important in our current political moment, to solve them in a way that does not require politics, right?
mhm.
So if we simply find the appropriate combination of technologies, um, then we will not need the messy, squishy politics that goes with infrastructure institutions, right? And I think that this is not just, in things like Silicon Valley, I think we could look at this in like the Maha movement, for example,
Hmm.
right? We don't need universal health care and public health if we eat enough beef tallow or whatever it is that,
Hmm.
people care about in the
Yeah.
Maha
Right.
movement. This is it's virtue and it's morality without politics.
Hmm.
One of the biggest proponents of this, of course, is Peter Thiel, who is
Yeah.
explicit that he hopes the technology can solve the problem of needing politics. Um,
Yeah.
I find this both deeply fascinating on an intellectual level and also deeply terrifying on a personal level.
Yeah, because anytime you
Because
get two people together, politics begins.
yeah,
I mean,
and
it's
also
just how humans interact.
yeah.
you have to be a misanthrope to want to get rid of that.
Well, and when you dig down into it, anti-politics is politics, right? It's just that
Right. Yeah.
it often leads to, in the same way that like refusing to make a choice is a choice.
Yes.
Hmm.
And when you look at people who are, deeply anti-politics, like the Peter Thiels of the world, what you find is that they are extremely pro-politics. It's just that they're pro a particularly noxious version of politics that if they just came out and say it would be far less palatable than going, we should just get rid of being,
Yes. Yeah.
political, right?
Absolutely right.
And
Absolutely
yeah.
right. Well, this has been fantastic, but I think we should probably honor the clock and let's move on. I know we've talked about discoveries of the week, so why don't we move on to discoveries of the week?
Um, my discovery of the week, I had one at the start. I have discovered that Americans can make coffee properly if you give them a chance.
Ooh,
Um,
bold
I
words.
so as someone from Australia, we don't have religion, we have coffee. Um, the Australians are famous for the flat white.
Hmm.
There is a new espresso bar here in Lowell where I live.
Hmm.
And I have over the last couple of months been assisting the nice young people who work there in the development of the flat white. And they've really dialed it in. And so I can now get, a good cup of coffee, an 8.5 minute walk from my house, which
Wow.
I am thankful for living in a walkable community, which
Hmm.
is not common in the United States these days.
Hmm.
And I am thankful for the availability of quality espresso, in my life because I wouldn't be able to get through the day without it.
That's
And
nice. And
how,
you made it happen yourself too.
yeah, exactly. That
Yeah.
like how community is that, right? To be able to
Yeah.
influence your own coffee and share the knowledge with the staff.
to to give a shout out to my city, because many of your listeners may not know where Lowell is or what Lowell is. Lowell is the home of the American labor movement, right?
Hmm.
And that labor movement is not a movement of men; it's a movement of women. The mill girls, who initially went on strike for better conditions and better wages, when they were working in the heart of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. And to this day, one of the great things about living in Lowell is that they have a really strong sense of community that comes from that tradition of being a town of unions, being a town of labor. And it's great.
All I remember from Lowell is when my son played Pop Warner football,
Mhm.
the team from Westboro would go out to Lowell, and we noted that every football game there was one ambulance available in
Mhm.
case there was an injury. In Lowell, there were two.
We're a
And
rough
that,
town.
and the cheerleaders were very, very serious about what they did. So, yeah, a great town, but a little intimidating to us suburbans. So,
I think that Massachusetts, I mean, I still have people in Massachusetts who are like, "Oh my God, you live in Lowell. That's so dangerous." I'm like, "Darling, I'm it's not the 1980s anymore, right? Like
Right,
like
right.
Lowell was dangerous for a while, right? Don't get me
Yeah,
Hmm.
wrong. But I think it is now the fourth safest city of its size in the United States of America. It's one of the homes of community policing on this country. So we don't have a lot of police shootings. We don't have a lot of violent crime. We have petty crime like everywhere else. We have drug
Hmm.
problems like everywhere else in America. But living in community means living with the problems of other people.
absolutely.
But just like with our preprint conversations, I think this is a case where the benefits far outweigh the costs. So I'm
Right.
I'm glad to live here.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to
Well,
take the
I
next whack if you don't mind, Joy. At
okay, go
Discovery
ahead.
of the Week, since it's Lowell proximal in a way. So I've discovered a book. I've somehow wandered back in by the rediscovered vinyl and everything else to the band The Cars,
Hmm.
and remembered what great music they have. And then there's a book I came across called The Cars Let the Stories Be Told. And it just came out at the end of September. And it's a fantastic book because it takes you through how all the band members kind of converged into Boston, met up, you know, interacted with each other. Jay Giles is, from Worcester, and how
Hmm.
that band was storming Boston at the time. Aerosmith, Van Morrison, Tom Schultz of Boston, all
Hmm.
these people, and it's just taking you. It's like they're in Route 2. They're going to Southborough. They're going to, Hudson. They're going to all these places around Boston, and it's just such a fun read. And then just how, it's just a wonderful book. So my discovery of the week is a book called "The Cars Let the Story Be Told." Stories be told, and fantastic. And if you're into reading about the Boston area, I would recommend it, or the Cars, or just great music history.
Fabulous. And Boston has great music history, so
Yeah,
I'll look that up.
yeah,
Well, as a recent transplant from Massachusetts to Virginia, my discovery of the week is also about community and my specific community, meaning the cul-de-sac that I live in. Even though my parents have owned this house for 30 years, I haven't spent long periods of time here. And what I learned from one of my neighbors just this morning is that it's deer hunting season. And apparently there is a bow hunter who's been helping to thin the herd in our backyards for the last 30 years. And he found out because he just moved in with his two little kids. And his wife came home and said, "Why is there a bow hunter in our backyard?" And so we had to kind of put our heads together and call a few people and to say we had no idea. But apparently that's just something that's been going on, and he and his wife are super friendly people. But we needed to say, by the way, we just need to know what's going on here and what are the rules and,
right.
and all
Do we
of
need
that.
orange vests?
Well, right. I said, Pete, you're gonna have to dress your kids in orange for the rest of the season, you know. But they're lovely people, but it's something that just never occurred to me, but
And it's so quiet that
it's so
probably nobody
quiet
noticed.
and it's been an important part of this neighborhood for a very long time. So
That's incredible.
Fascinating.
All right, Nick. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time.
Thank you.
We'll have this up next week, and we really appreciate it.
yeah, this
Wonderful.
was great. We learned a lot. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks both.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music. Pre-order our book if you want. And as always, let us know what you think. You can reach us at disruptedscience@gmail.com, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.